Hello out there. Welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with Dr. Kaplan, and together we're going through the books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year, a little bit every day. Today we're going to be reading Genesis 25:19 through 26:5. I'll be reading from the Robert Alter translation, and then we'll comment on what we read. Did you have something? Go ahead.
Yes, hello out there. I'd like to correct a misspeak
Uh-oh.
that occurred.
Dun, dun, dun.
I meant to quote from Jonah 1:14, and instead I said Genesis 1:14. But actually, it's Jonah 1:9, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. When they asked Jonah about himself, so he said, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear Yahweh, or the eternal Adonai Hashem, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." So you see here how in Jonah 1:9, being a Hebrew is associated with worshiping the God of the Bible, and I associated it back with Abraham in Genesis 14. So I'm sorry about the misspeaking, and if we make a mistake in these discussions, we try to correct them.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, and please comment if you ever catch us making any errors. We certainly would love to correct them if you do find them. Maybe we'll give you a prize or something. Okay. Genesis 25:19. And this is the lineage of Isaac, son of Abraham. Isaac begot Abraham, sorry. See, now I'm doing it. Abraham begot Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took as wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, from Padam Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. And Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife, for she was barren. And the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children clashed together within her. And she said, "Then why me?" And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations in your womb, two peoples from your loins shall issue. People over people shall prevail, the elder the younger slave." And when her time was come to give birth, look, there were twins in her womb. And the first one came out ruddy, like a hairy mantle all over, and they called his name Esau. Then his brother came out, his hand grasping Esau's heel, and they called his name Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. And the lads grew up, and Esau was a man skilled in hunting, a man of the field, and Jacob was a simple man, a dweller in tents. And Isaac loved Esau for the game that he brought him, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob prepared a stew, and Esau came from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me gulp down some of this red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore is his name called Edom. And Jacob said, "Sell now your birthright to me." And Esau said, "Look, I am at the point of death, so why do I need a birthright?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me now." And he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate, and he drank, and he rose, and he went off. And Esau spurned the birthright. And there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of Philistines, in Gerar. And the Lord appeared unto him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt, stay in the land that I shall say to you. Sojourn in this land, so that I may be with you and bless you. For to you and your seed I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. And I will multiply your seed like the stars in the heavens, and I will give to your seed all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through your seed, because Abraham has listened to my voice, and has kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my teachings." Okay. All right. So we have the beginning of what is going to become quite a exciting story, a very tense story between these two people. But before even that, we go back to the beginning of their origins, and we have the same kind of situation where we have an intervention needed for the sake of fertility. And I think it's interesting that you see that repetition, right? Because it's certainly such a major part of, I mean, if you just think of basic human life, right? One of our basic human needs is the need for reproduction. And so when you have that as a tension point and something that people are concerned with, obviously that puts people in a very vulnerable state. But what's interesting is specifically how it says Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife, for she was barren, which is interesting that the assumption is that the problem would just have to be with her necessarily, although maybe not, but it is interesting. What are your thoughts when it comes to that? Like the repetition is there. The difference here, obviously, is unlike in the other story, they don't try to really take matters into their own hands. It's it's just worked out. There's no concubine situation or anything like that. But it's what do you think the repetition here with that concept?
Well, he was 40 when he married, and evidently was 60 when the children were born. So there was a 20-year period. Now, it's not as extreme as
Right.
we have with Abraham and Sarah, but it's still interesting, and it does show a certain test of faith on their part, which you could say they passed,
Hmm.
and also a divine intervention involved in the birth, as Daniel pointed out. And it's interesting. It says, now Isaac pleaded for Rebekah. So what is going on here? Well, I think it does show the importance of what we call intercessory prayer, that we should pray for each other. I don't think anybody fully understands how prayer works, but the Bible reveals certain things about prayer, and one thing it reveals is we should be praying for each other. But I think the fact that it mentions Isaac pleading for his wife, it goes back to the fact that there's promises that go from Abraham to Isaac, and then through these various patriarchal figures through Jacob, and then he has his 12 sons that become the tribes. So it sort of brings us back to the promise God made to Abraham when it mentions that Isaac pleaded for Rebekah. I think that's
Hmm.
maybe one reason it's worded that way.
Yeah, another thing you can think of is Isaac is there's a lot of Christology with Isaac, right? And then and Jesus is also the
Yeah,
high priest pleading on our behalf
that's a
in
good
a
point.
sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you take it as also an allegory, you have that as well, and
Listen,
you have certainly periods of time, and this is something we need to keep in mind too if we're thinking of the church, the body. There are going to be times that there is not going to be the fruit that we want. There's not going to be that reproduction even though we know that the church will always prevail, there's always going to be, you know, Bible believing people in the world. There are times when we do not see that propagation that we're looking for, right?
that
That's a little bit of an understatement, but
uh, that reminds me of a conversation I had a long time ago with a very esteemed teacher of mine, a kind of a father figure. He's no longer alive, but he made this comment to me. You know, there are still 7,000. What was it that God said to Elijah there?
hmm.
There are still 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. He made a comment like
Right.
that to me when I was so concerned about how everything seemed to be falling apart.
Yeah. Now, immediately, what's interesting too is that she has the situation where the babies are even fighting within her, which I think there's a couple of times in the Bible where you have this sense, and I think to some degree what the Bible is getting at is the sense of humanity even at that stage, which is something we certainly should keep in mind. But it does allow her to ask this question, right? It's a sign so she can ask God, so God can prepare her for the situation because obviously she's going to get thrust into a very difficult situation. The last thing that parents want is a sibling rivalry on this sort of scale. So it is right that she would have this foreknowledge about it, right? And it's a rather sad it's a rather sad thing to have to deal with, right? It's incredibly challenging. I can only imagine.
It mentions that he was ruddy, and so it seems like that concept of calling him, Edom, coming, the redness comes later from the lentils that he sold his birthright for. But I think we even have a hint of that in the fact that he came out ruddy.
Uh-huh.
So, and also evidently the name Esau is related to being hairy. So he was a very hairy child when he came out. And maybe this is kind of indicative of maybe being a kind of a wilder personality type. And another thing too, Jacob's name is based on the word for heel because he grabbed the heel of his brother, and so it tends to mean supplanter. You grab the heel of the one ahead of you, and in effect, therefore you kind of jump over him. And this was his life reflected that. Later on, he had to wrestle. He wrestled with God later on, but he went from heel to he who overcomes with God. So that's kind of the conversion process summarized. You go from a heel to, to he who overcomes with God. Another thing about Jacob and Esau is that uh, I'm struck because it seems that Rebecca got this somehow this inspired message.
Hmm.
We don't know how it was conveyed to her. Maybe she just God directly
It's
spoke to her
yeah, just it
somehow.
says in this translation it says, and the Lord said to her. So yeah, in
Oh,
what form? I don't know.
I see.
Seems kind of like based on the if this fits the same pattern. It seems similar to what we were saying with like Abraham and others.
Well, if that's the case, it seems that she did not share this with Isaac, or if she did, he took it differently,
Hmm.
or 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 uh, or over time it didn't stay in his consciousness because his behavior later doesn't seem to reflect the knowledge of this prophecy initially. The way as we'll, if we keep reading.
Yeah, I have thoughts about that as we keep reading, so we'll get
Okay,
there.
all right, all right.
But as we start out here, it's interesting because they, the boys grow up and they say Esau was skilled in hunting and Jacob was a simple man, a dweller in tents, which you could get to like maybe simple as like righteous is put
Could
together.
yeah.
But what's also interesting is when you compare hunting and tents, right? Because hunting is somebody that's going out and finding their own food and everything. And tents, you get the sense of you think of when you think of tents in the Bible, you think of like Festival of Tabernacles, you think of this reliance almost. I don't know. It feels like it's kind of getting at something like that. That one of the people was more of a go getter, maybe a little bit more materialistic, and the other person was a little bit more dependent on God for provisions. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I just see there's a juxtaposition going on there that I think is beyond just these are their professions. I think there's a moralistic point to be made there.
Well, it may be that we're going back to Nimrod the hunter, who
Hmm.
who was a hunter, but at the same time had seemingly a defiant attitude. Nimrod could be translated "Let's rebel,"
Hmm.
and so maybe the hunter side indicates a certain aggressive personality. And
Well,
years
I,
years
well, I guess what I was getting at here was specifically because it's like it says the way he translates it, a man of the field versus a dweller in tents. So it's
uh,
like a worldly person versus somebody that feels they need to shelter themselves from something. They need to like kind of cloister themselves. You see the
uh,
difference? I don't know. But again, I could be reading too much into it. Let me know.
well, uh, when I was in my youth studying this, uh, it was brought out that Isaac perhaps was more of a Jacob type personality himself, and he admired the boldness and the I guess athleticism and physicality, whatever, of Esau. 'Cause Esau perhaps was perhaps one who could. This also was brought out later in what I read. One who could perhaps defend the family, who maybe could stand up to the pressure
Hmm.
around him. So
It's
I
interesting then,
yeah
considering you'll have the wrestling later. Then
yeah
that's the way that God tests him. And maybe that's one reason why he does, is because if he was kind of the runt, then it makes sense in order to level him up that he has to have this sort of fight, which would give him a sort of inner strength. Imagine if you have this idea within the family that it's like, well, he's the tough one and you're the weak one, and then eventually he's going to wrestle with God and be victorious. I mean, that's quite a leveling up of somebody. So
right, yeah, that really does kind of dramatically conclude the account in certain ways. Um, Now, when Esau, of course, this is a classic an allegory here about selling your birthright
Hmm.
for pottage, as the old King James I think said, and it's brought out in the New Testament. It's something that's become really an idiom in English, more or less.
Hmm.
Selling out your birthright for a mess of pottage became a kind of a standard uh, this, point of discussion. But it's interesting the way things are worded here is that he didn't value the birthright.
Mm-mm.
If he had thought it through, he wouldn't have made this decision. Later
Right.
on, he regretted it. But it's interesting that he was just concerned with his immediate gratification,
Hmm.
and it's brought up rather dramatically in the abrupt way this is worded. The Jews have some very interesting traditions about this, but if you just look at it, he ate, he drank, he arose, and
Hmm.
went his way. It's like he was just concerned with his
Yeah.
immediate gratification.
Yep.
There was not a lot of consideration or thought
Hmm.
or just whatever. He just basically knocked it in and left.
Hmm.
And the way it's worded kind of you get this idea of somebody who not really a very thoughtful person.
Right. And
And in fact, it says he despised his birthright.
right.
So that's very strong language there.
Yeah. No, it's very true. It is interesting because we hear that Isaac loved Esau because of the game that he brought
Oh
him,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then it says Rebecca loved Jacob. It doesn't specifically say why. And then what's interesting is the next scene we have is Jacob is cooking. So it could be that one of the reasons why Jacob was even working on this sort of stuff was maybe to try to get his father's good graces. He was trying to level up his cooking skills. Uh, although he's doing something that it doesn't seem to have meat. It's just it's grains and stuff like that. But it is interesting, right? Because when it says that, I don't know. It just makes me wonder if that's something going on there. One reason why he would have been working on some stew. Um, Possible.
There seems to be again, this is speculative, but there seems to be somehow a lack of communication between Rebecca and
Hmm.
Isaac. You know, one favors one son, one favors the other.
Right.
These are things that should have been worked out, especially in light of the prophecy.
Right.
So, as I said, this is a troubling account in many ways, and
Yep.
but it does show, as much of the Bible shows, particularly these early accounts, is that history is very messy.
Yes.
Things work out because God's overall in charge, but
Right.
because we're dealing with people, it gets very messy. You think of the later on we'll read about Tamar and what she did, etc.
Hmm.
So things don't go smoothly here on Earth.
Yeah. No, it's very true. And then just to finish up this section, we have where we um, where we have God specifically saying to Isaac, "Do not leave this area." He's the one that doesn't do that. He never leaves the land of Israel, which is interesting. And then you get the repetition of the promise about the multiplication and all of that.
Hmm.
And then it ends with the rather famous passage where it says, Abraham has listened to my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my teachings. And the fact that it has to relay all those different categories does make one wonder what specific information Abraham knew. The Bible doesn't specifically tell us. You have clues, and we'll talk about them as we go along. We've already talked about sacrifices and the dietary laws, but you get and adultery and other things. You get and murder. Like there's clues that they definitely had a sense of a lot of the laws. People debate as to how much, but certainly more than what we know about, right? Otherwise, because it's
Yeah,
like my teachings and all. He hasn't really taught him much in the narrative. He's just
yeah.
told him what's going to happen. So what is all that? We don't really know. Like we can't be that definitive about.
Hmm.
So, any other thoughts about this section before we wrap things up?
We have a lot more to do.
Yes, there's more coming in this story. Yes, this sibling rivalry is only going to get more and more interesting. So, if you haven't liked, subscribe, hit the bell, share this with your friends. Let's read through the law together, and we will see you tomorrow.